Hello everyone, I'm Wasim Afzal, faculty member at School of Information Studies, Charles Sturt University, Australia. It's a great pleasure for me to record this presentation for University of Kentucky School of Information Science students. The topic of my presentation is surveillance and commodification of information. In terms of the presentation outline, I will briefly talk about my own background and then we'll touch base on the research relevant to current presentation in order to give you a context about some of my ideas, about this topic. Then I will define some terms and then we will look at surveillance, means of surveillance, commodification, and finally I will close, with talking about some of the recent developments that are very pertinent to this topic and implications for information professionals. In terms of my own background, so I born and raised in Pakistan. I did Masters of Commerce with emphasis in finance at Punjab University, Pakistan. Then moved to the USA for higher studies and started doing MBA. So, and while I was doing MBA, obviously I had already, had my objective to do a PhD in management. But I got to know some people, at School of Library and Information Management at Emporia State University, where I was doing my MBA as well. So I got interested in information science. I found the area to be very relevant to some of the things that I have been studying in my MBA. And also, there were some other topics that I wanted to study, in particular with economics of information and properties of information, which I will talk about, briefly. So anyways, I then ended up, in doing a PhD, which I thoroughly enjoyed, I also fell in love with basketball and became a big fan of Jayhawks, which I'm still, a fan of. I moved to Australia a couple of years ago, mostly for job purposes because I got a job offer. So I then moved to Australia. Now, in terms of the research relevant to current presentation, so one of the aspect of my PhD thesis was actually looking at information and privacy security concerns of users, right? But that was in the perspective of online buying and selling. So I got exposed to area of information privacy and security and properties of information or qualities of information approximately, I would say, 10 or 11 years ago. I also studied the qualities of information and their role in product valuation back in 2009. Then I looked at the role of the qualities of information or properties of information in shaping extremist content and also shaping perception of extremists, right? So all the first three strands are very closely tied up with each other, like looking at information privacy and security, but also looking at the qualities and properties of information. And finally, back in 2018, I proposed a research agenda for information behavior. I would say mostly arguing that we need to consider more the affective, emotional aspects and also what makes information experiences highly, I would say, attention focused, right? And what does it mean actually for information behavior, when we have these kind of information experiences? So let's look at some of the terms. So surveillance is a noun, and the Webster Dictionary defines it simply as watch kept over a person. Commodification is also a noun, and Oxford English Dictionary defines it as the action or process of treating a person or thing as property which can be traded or whose value is purely monetary. It is always a good idea to define the terms so we know what actually they mean, right? So surveillance, if you look at from the purely a dictionary standpoint, it is watch kept over a person. But then the question comes, why we need to kept a watch over a person, right? So it can be due to various reasons. It is not necessarily due to suspicion, right? Because if you look at the definition of commodification, it is that you have something which can be treated as of a value, monetary value, right? So then we can link these two together and see that why there is a need, or why there's an increase, I would say, in surveillance, with the purpose of gathering more and more information, because information can be commodified, right? Because it can be sold, it can be used primarily for purposes that has monetary value, but also for purposes that may have other value, right? And we will talk about that. So let's look at surveillance. Surveillance has been there, I think, since ever. Even before technology, political rivals used to do surveillance on each other. Even big empires, 1,000 years or 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or even before that, they used to spy on each other in order to gather information about each other's tactics. So it is nothing new, right? However, the magnitude and the means used for surveillance, they are something new, and obviously there's a role of technology in that. Surveillance can be done by a government or set of governments, and obviously there can be very legitimate reasons by governments to do surveillance, for example, for national security reasons. And I will give you one example. So there is a group which is called as Group of Five Eyes, and this group includes Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Canada, and America. And they share information with each other, obviously about any suspicious activities which may offer concern for national security. So this is an example where set of governments come together, in order to have surveillance over individuals. Then there can be a government to do surveillance, and that surveillance can be for varied reasons. You can name it. It can, as I said, it can be for national security reasons. It can be for planning purposes even, right? It can be to even support, for example, disaster relief, efforts. So there can be different purposes, right? Surveillance can also be done by corporations, and corporations can do surveillance. Obviously, one major reason is to increase their profits, and because they want to know what are the current existing customers' buying behavior, and from that they can predict the future demand. But also, based on what the consumers are buying right now, they can promote their existing products, or can come up with new products in order to target these consumers and increase their profits. One other reason by corporations for surveillance can be to improve their services, right, or improve their products. But as I said, the primary reason is to increase their profits. Not-for-profit organizations can also use surveillance, but surveillance not in a strict sense of that you are suspicious of something. No, that's not the case. I will give an example. Many libraries, archives, museums, they do door counts, right? And they also keep a record of how their spaces are being used. So it is a form of surveillance, right? But the purpose of it is not to get something out of their clients. It is actually, number one, it can be to enhance the quality of their services. Number two, it can be for the purpose of demonstrating their value to funding organizations, right? Number three, it can be to promote their services to underserved populations. Because not-for-profits, and as I said, particularly libraries, archives, museums, galleries, they are not in business of making money. They are in the business of increasing public good, right? So they can also do surveillance for that purpose. So the purpose of surveillance can be highly specific or it can be very general. And I will give you an example from a very general standpoint. There can be three very general purposes. Number one, surveillance can be done to stop an action. Number two, it can be done to encourage an action. And number three, it can be done to change an action, right? So normally surveillance by corporations or the governments are geared toward these three main purposes, right? Not-for-profits, as I said, their purposes can be quite different from the ones that I mentioned. Now, in terms of highly specific purposes, so for example, you have set up a new maker space, right, in your library, and you want to assess, for example, how much is the usage of that, right? So you may keep a track record of this. This is also a form of a surveillance, right? But the purpose here is highly specific and also geared towards increasing the quality of your service, not making money out of it, right? So that can be an example of a very specific. Similarly, if you have set up a new copier in your library, or if you have brought a new artifact in your museum and you want to know that how many people accessed description of this artifact through your website, you can track a record of this thing, right? Again, it's a very highly specific aspect of surveillance, not a very general one. Means of surveillance can also be highly diverse. So for example, 40, 50 or 60 years ago, surveillance used to involve very direct means of observation. You have to go into the area where you want to have surveillance, and you may observe people over there, obviously, in secret perhaps, right? Or you used to, like the governments used to, intercept the letters, or the telegrams or the telegraph, right? So the means of surveillance were quite different. Now, because of, I would say, extraordinary advances in technology, means of surveillance have been changed tremendously. So, for example, now most of surveillance can be done indirectly through technology, because our actions, our behavior now from major part is being manifested in an online environment, and I will talk about it in a later slide, but so because our behavior is being manifested, as I said, in an online environment, so it has become easier for different agencies, organizations, and even for non-state actors to have surveillance done on individuals and group of people, because it is all out there, right? So people can have still, as I said, obviously they can use internet, for surveillance purposes, but in addition to that, still there can be wiretapping, there can be tapping of phones, like recording of the phone communication, video surveillance also is still there. Face recognition is an example, that you can put the cameras in the public areas, and those cameras may have the capability, or may have already actually the capability to recognize through the facial features, who this person was, right? So means of surveillance, as I said, also have become quite sophisticated in current times. Now let's look at commodification of information, because that's our main topic today. Is I mentioned in the third slide when I was defining the terms that commodification of information partly has become possible because of surveillance, because we can document information. Information was always there, right? Since antiquity, information has been there. The change, or a major change, has been that we can document lots and lots of information about human behavior, I would say, for most part, we can record it, right? And because there can be record of each and every human action, I shouldn't say each and every human action, but for lots of human actions, they can be recorded, as I said. So therefore, there's a value in surveillance, of this information which is out there. And because that information is of value, therefore we can commodify it. Okay, so one reason is, to have commodification of information is, number one, obviously, as I said, surveillance. Number two, which is intrinsic to information, and that is qualities of information. Because there are certain qualities of information which creates monetary value. And not only monetary value, there are other, aspects of the value, which I will talk about also in next slide. So let's look at some of these qualities. So qualities of information can be broadly classified into two categories, qualitative and quantitative. And there are various qualitative properties of information, and you can find heaps of literature in information science about qualitative properties. We have been talking about relevance from a long time, that information, is of value when it is of relevance, to the purpose that we have at hand, right? Stefko-Srazovich research, is all about relevance. Then currency, whether it is current or not. Organization, how it is organized, right? And there are other qualitative properties of information, but I will just talk about these, right? So these qualitative properties of information enhance I would say, usability of information for a particular purpose, right? Then there are quantitative properties of information. The quantitative properties of information have been mostly researched in economics, not in information science. So I will give you an example. So first property is asymmetry. Asymmetry is actually that you have more information about a particular thing or a phenomenon more than me, right? So you have informational advantage over me. I will give you one example. Let's suppose you want to sell your car to me, right? Because you own this car, let's say from last 10 years, so you know more about this car than me, right? So you have informational advantage. So you can use this informational advantage to charge higher price to me, right? So here asymmetry, like unevenness of information between you and me, gives you a monetary advantage, right? So asymmetry is one. Then comes skewness. Skewness is also closely related with asymmetry, that you have more information about a certain thing than me, right? But then what is the nature of this kind of information? I will give you one example. Let's suppose global warming, right? So if you're a scientist, you may know more about global warming than me. Because I'm a layperson, I don't know about global warming much, right? You know both the positive and the negative information about global warming, right? If you decide to give only positive information to me, right? So you already have like informational advantage over me. But if you give me only positive information, you say, oh, there is no immediate risk of global warming, we can just take it easy. So not only we have asymmetry of information, but the asymmetry is positively skewed because you have given me positively biased information. So skewness, in one sense, you can say biasness. Information which is positively biased or information which can be negatively biased. And in politics, you will see this a lot, right? Because every side, would use whatever information they could have, on their side for their benefit, rather than, providing a balanced argument. The third quantitative property is access. So when there is too much information about a particular thing or topic, when there will be too much information, obviously then it will create, what do you call it, as overload, right? Because you have to process that information. So that is going to be a problem, because it may create ambiguity, confusion, and even people may run away, in order to avoid this all, access or mess of information, right? Last, I would say scarcity, that when there is not too much information about a particular thing, and it is quite possible, for example, we don't know much yet about, let's say, is there a life possible on Mars or not, or other planets, right? Maybe we come to know in next couple of years or decades, I don't know, but there's still a scarcity about that. So all these qualitative and quantitative properties of information are highly valuable, and they, along with surveillance, can help, or even without surveillance, can help in purpose of commodification of information. So potential uses. So why we commodify information? Number one purpose is decision making. Obviously when you have information which is mostly, I would say, in aggregated form, then it can help in decision making. Number two, public perception. When you have information which is being collected through surveillance, it can be used to influence public perception, and you would see it again and again, whether through governments or through corporations. Policy making. A very, very important aspect of, I would say, surveillance and commodification of information is to inform policy. From a non-profit sector standpoint, I would say funding is a very important aspect, because in Australia, for example, State Library of New South Wales and State Library of Victoria and State Library of Queensland, they commissioned studies, very big studies, in order to demonstrate the value of libraries. And obviously they collected information, not through surveillance, but through collecting data about the users, how they have been using different, services of the library, and their, perceptions about the library. And then they demonstrated how much the library services and library contribution is in terms of dollar terms. And similar studies have been done in America as well as in Canada, right? Prediction. We are all, I shouldn't say we are all, but from an economic standpoint and from a corporate standpoint and even from a national security standpoint, people are interested in prediction. And therefore, you have to have information in order to, assess, what can be the possibility or possibilities. Estimation. That we need to estimate, for example, through surveillance, okay, what can be, for example, our resource requirement for energy 20 years from now. Because if you have been collected information about your population, their growth rates, and also I would say their different needs, then you can estimate, and obviously then you can predict. Similarly, in the libraries, museums and archives, if we have been collecting data about the usage behavior, right? How users have been using our online resources, what kind of online resources they have been using, what has been print collection usage in the last 2 years, and then you can obviously estimate and predict, right? And finally, I would say legitimacy. For lots of services, and from GLAM standpoint, like galleries, libraries, archives, museums, you ought to have information in the current kind of environment in order to demonstrate that our services are of extreme value. And not only in dollar terms. What does it mean in terms of having a very educated civilized population? What does it mean? Very culturally informed and very open population. What does it mean, right? So and the role of the libraries, museums, and all these organizations have been monumental in, I would say, democratizing the societies, but also having a population, which is open to ideas, and also have the ability, to traverse through heaps of information. Okay, let's move on to the last bit of the presentation, and that I will just want to briefly mention some of the recent developments. So first, technological developments. We all know about, social media, Google, Facebook, Twitter. So there's nothing new I can add in terms of, the social media. But what I would like to add here is, which many of us may not know, that Facebook, Google, and Twitter, they actually aggregate the user data, like they de-identify it. And in the recent past, the figures that I have, it demonstrate that they sold this data to advertisers. So for example, in 2011, Facebook sold aggregated information behavior data for $3.2 billion. Google sold the aggregated data which they collected from the email exchanges of their users, again de-identified, and they sold it for $36.5 billion. In 2014, Twitter sold aggregated data for $70 million, right? So these are big numbers, right? And again, these figures are a bit old, right? So I don't know, it will be worth checking what is happening right now. The other aspect that I would like to draw your attention to, because obviously you're all information professional, and that is from a behavioral standpoint, there are changes. Number one is limbic concentration. And what do I mean by that? So in the past, before I would say 1990, most of our needs were being satisfied through I would say activation of almost all of our limbs, like hands, feet, eyes, ears, tongue, mind, obviously stomach, and all of that, right? However, what is happening now, because we got internet and we can satisfy a lot of our needs by just sitting on a laptop or using our iPhone, so there has been a limbic concentration, and I would say 3 limbs are being increasingly used now, much more than the others. Number one, frontal lobe of our brain, which is used for information processing. Number two, our eyes, and number three, our fingers for typing. What does it mean? Because for our other limbs, right? What does it mean for deep thinking? What does it mean for our physical activity? Like, what does it mean our ability to have face-to-face connection? So anyways, it is something, I think as an information professional, you should think about, or as a student of information science, you should think about. Other thing is informational concentration. So as I said, in the past, you may go to a post office to pay a bill, or you may go to a bank to deposit the money, or transfer money from one account to another account. You go to Walmart to do shopping, but that has been changed a lot. Like now, what is happening? So most of our interactions, they are online. So because they are online, therefore they can be documented. Whether you are on Facebook, Twitter, or Google, whether you are on the email, whether you are on Snapchat or Instagram, whether you are reading news or you are searching, for your symptoms, whether you got the flu or not. So what is happening now? There is an informational concentration, like documented informational concentration, and that is helping a bit of surveillance, right? That's also something which you need to think about. But there are other implications as well. So what does it all mean for information professionals? So I would say traditionally we have been thinking, and for right reasons, about information literacy, and we need to continue to think about that. However, in addition to information literacy, we need to think about information privacy and security. That's really, really important. What does it mean about the privacy and security of our users' data and information? What does it mean for our own organizations? Information management. If we are documenting and creating so much information, how we are going to manage it? As an information professional, you need to think about the ways to do that. Information packaging. What if your library director or museum director or, a law library director, she or he is asking you, okay, I want information, on this topic or on this topic, how you're going to package that? Because information packaging is really, really important, and we ought to develop these skills in us as information professionals, but also in our users too. What does it mean for information policy? Is information policy keeping up with the developments which are happening in the technology environment and also, in other environments as well? So that's very important. And finally, what does it mean, for community groups? Both the community groups which are traditionally or have been traditionally able to use all these sources and services, but what about those community groups which haven't been able to use information, for one reason or another reasons, because they were being marginalized or they were being not heard in the past, right? So what does it mean for you as an information professional to make sure that they can use also information in order to become more informed citizens, right? And these are all, I think, important implications for us as information professionals to think about. Thanks very much. These are some of the selected references that I've used in this slide. So thanks so much for listening to this presentation. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Bye.